broadcast tonight, the vice foreign ministers of Korea and Japan meet in Seoul in search for ways to mend frosty bilateral ties. Korea unveils a plan aimed at turning the country into one of the world's 4 largest oil trading centers. Plus, UN investigators say North Korea is using increasingly deceptive maneuvers to evade international sanctions. But these stories and more next on Arirang News at 8. Good evening to our viewers in Korea and hello to those of you who are watching from around the world. It's Wednesday, March 12th here in Korea. I'm Yoo Ji-hye. We begin this evening here in Seoul, where the vice foreign ministers of South Korea and Japan held talks for the first time in 8 months. The two neighboring countries discussed mending bilateral ties, which have reached a new low over Tokyo's shift to the right. Our Hwang Sung-hee reports.
Japanese Vice Foreign Minister Akitake Saiki arrived in Seoul Wednesday for talks with his South Korean counterpart Cho Tae-yong. The meeting, which came at Tokyo's request, was the first vice foreign ministerial-level talks between the two neighbors in 8 months. Tensions are high between South Korea and Japan over Japan's constant distortion of historical and territorial facts. Seoul feels as though Tokyo has never officially apologized for its sexual enslavement of roughly 200,000 women in the early 20th century, as Japanese politicians consistently make negative comments about the so-called comfort women. The diplomatic row has taken its toll on the South Korean public's perception of Japan. Public sentiment on Japan is so low that a recent poll released by the Asan Institute for Policy Studies show that South Koreans perceive Japan as a bigger threat than North Korea. According to the Asan poll, more than 65% of the South Korean public feel threatened by Japan, larger than the 60% of the population that fear North Korea. The figure reflects Seoul's overall consensus on Tokyo.
And that, I'm sure, coincides with all the statements about comfort women, the increased attention that Japan is paying towards Dokdo. And so all of these things are starting to drive up these threat perceptions. Now, of course, the question is there a real threat? Is it a real perceived threat, or is it something that anytime you include a question on Japan, you get a negative response?
And it looks like the public sentiment in Seoul will remain low for a while, as Japanese Prime Minister Shinzo Abe continues to press his right-wing policies. South Korean President Park Geun-hye is insistent she will not sit down with a leader who fails to acknowledge his country's historical wrongdoings. Hwang Sung-hee, Arirang News.
Now, commenting on the strained ties between Seoul and Tokyo, South Korea's top military officer has stressed the importance of cooperating with Japan on security issues in the face of continued threats from North Korea. Our Kwon So-ah has more.
Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Admiral Choi Yoon-hee, is on a week-long trip in the United States to reaffirm and strengthen the Korea-U.S. alliance and talk about security issues on the Korean peninsula. He met with his counterpart, Army General Martin Dempsey, at the Pentagon on Tuesday local time for the first time since coming into the post last year. The two discussed a range of security issues, including bolstering combat readiness against North Korea. Choi also emphasized that Japan's cooperation is needed to deal with North Korean issues. Admiral Choi told reporters after the meeting that South Korea, the U.S., and Japan must form a tight trilateral partnership to deal with the constant and unpredictable threats posed by the North Korean regime. He also said he would keep an eye on the bilateral relationship between Korea and Japan while promoting security cooperation between the two countries. He added, however, that this does not constitute an immediate military alliance. Another topic that came up during the 2-hour meeting between the two military officers was the transfer of operational control over South Korean forces from the U.S. to South Korea in the event of a war. But Choi told reporters it is not yet time to set a date for the transfer. He also expressed his hope for a comprehensive strategic partnership between South Korea and the U.S. in various fields, including politics, the economy, and society, in addition to their solid military alliance based on 60 years of cooperation. Kwon So-ah, Arirang News.
Well, Korea is looking into getting UN recognition of sexual slavery by the Japanese military during World War II. At the UN Commission on the Status of Women in New York City Tuesday, Gender Equality and Family Minister Cho Yun-sun announced that the ministry will try to get documentation of Tokyo's war atrocities listed on UNESCO's Memory of the World Register. Cho said they are identifying items related to sexual slavery by Japan against Korea and neighboring countries and will submit them next year. A decision is expected by year 2017. Moving now to a report on North Korea's UN sanctions. It says the rogue state has developed an intricate web of measures to evade UN punishments that have been imposed on them for its nuclear weapons and missile programs. Our Shin Se-min tells us how they've managed to do so.
Pyongyang has developed a number of sophisticated ways to get around UN sanctions on illegal weapons trading. A UN report was released Tuesday as part of an annual accounting of North Korea's compliance with international sanctions. The report says that the isolated nation has been employing complicated financial countermeasures that made purchases of prohibited products more difficult to trace. It also said the North Korean embassies in Cuba and Singapore are suspected of facilitating illegal weapons deals, including a shipment of fighter jets and missile parts seized on a North Korean cargo ship in Panama last year. The report adds that there is a relatively complex corporate ecosystem of foreign-based firms that help the regime evade scrutiny of its financial dealings. One of the examples cited was a contract by North Korea's national carrier, Air Koryo, to purchase new jetliners in 2012. It said more than 100 payments were structured through 8 Hong Kong registered companies. While the purchase of civilian aircraft is not prohibited under UN sanctions, the report says such unusual activity could be used as a test run for illegal transactions. Officials at Seoul's foreign ministry said South Korea will work with the international community to better enforce sanctions that are already in place. Pyongyang is currently restricted under UN sanctions from shipping and receiving cargo related to its nuclear weapons and missile programs. Importing luxury goods and illicit transfers of cash are also prohibited. Shin Se-min, Arirang News.
And now to the latest on the North Korean flagged tanker that docked in the Rebel Sea's Libyan oil port late last week. There are conflicting reports today over the fate of that ship. A Libyan naval official says a fire broke out on the ship Tuesday night local time after it was hit by a missile. But further details are not currently available, and authorities haven't said who fired on the tanker. It was on its way to the eastern coast of Benghazi after leaving Libya's El Sidra port, which is under the control of rebels. On Tuesday, the tanker broke through a naval blockade, taking advantage of poor weather conditions to head for an open sea. The 37,000-ton tanker is believed to have loaded over $30 million worth of crude sold without the government's permission.
For the latest in news that impacts Korea and the world, join Yoo Ji-hye for a lively half hour that covers politics, business, international news, and much more. Live at 8 every weeknight on Arirang TV.
Move aimed at fostering startups is part of the government's 3-year economic innovation. The Korean government has unveiled a set of measures to boost the nation's regional economy by around $13 billion. They include easing development restrictions for mountainous areas and designating provincial development zones to fit with the characteristics of each region. Arirang's Hwang Ji-hye has the details.
The Korean government has been trying to spur the nation's economic recovery, and this time the focus is on regional economies. After a meeting led by President Park Geun-hye to foster trade and investment on Wednesday, the government laid out a set of measures to boost the regional economy. Under the latest plan, the government will help each municipal government develop a specialized industry like film and video industry for the southern port city of Busan and cultural content industry for the southwestern city of Gwangju.
Restrictions on how to use areas freed from greenbelt will be eased, and stronger incentives will be provided for private organizations developing park areas.
The government added that it will provide support for business projects that were voluntarily proposed by 56 regional blocs to develop new growth engines. Among measures aimed at helping turning rural areas into economically vibrant spots is the lifting of development restrictions in forested zones. That will allow the construction of commercial facilities in the so-called greenbelt areas. The only exception for such areas has been home construction. Now, the government expects the measures to boost investment in regional economies by around 14 trillion won, or roughly $13 billion US. It says no effort will be spared to promote corporate investment, which is the key to revitalizing regional economies. The government emphasizes that while the central government has unilaterally pushed for regional development so far, the measures this time around make local governments take the lead in drawing up their own development strategies. Hwang Ji-hye, Arirang News.
And another topic discussed at the meeting at the presidential office of Cheongwade was the government's ambitious plan to turn Korea into an oil trading hub for Northeast Asia. Na Young-kyung has more on what it takes to realize the goal and some of the challenges that lie ahead.
Becoming one of the world's major oil trading and storage hubs is what Korea is aiming for. Trade and Energy Minister Yoon Sang-jik said Wednesday that $1.8 billion in private sector investment will go into securing oil storage terminals that can hold nearly 60 million barrels of oil. The government says it wants this complete by the year 2020.
Geopolitically, Korea connects China and Japan, has world-renowned refineries, as well as good port facilities. That's why it is seen as the best spot for a new oil hub.
An annual oil trading volume of $25 billion is expected to be generated from 2021, and many billion dollars worth of economic benefits are expected in the next several years. The government hopes the terminals planned to be expanded in the country's southern cities of Ulsan and Yeosu will help the country serve as a major oil trading hub. Policymakers plan to offer favorable loans, tax breaks, and other incentives to oil traders setting up operations here, as well as eliminating red tape to create a better trading environment in the country. But some industry experts point out that the success of the government project will depend largely on the difficult task of building the financial infrastructure for the trading system. A researcher at the Korea Energy Economics Institute told Arirang News that one of the main problems is that the Korean won is not a major currency used in international trade, adding that reaching the government's goal of making Korea Northeast Asia's main oil hub could take well over a decade. Na Hyun-kyung, Arirang News.
Some welcome news on the job front. The number of newly employed workers in Korea rose at its fastest pace in 12 years in February, showing signs of improvement in the local economy. Kim Ji-yeon reports.
The Korean economy may be showing signs of improvement. The number of newly employed workers rose at its fastest pace in more than a decade last month. Statistics Korea says the number of those employed in February stood at 24.8 million, up 835,000 from a year earlier. The figure represents the largest on-year job growth since March 2002. The country's unemployment rate, however, shot up to 4.5%, a half a percentage point increase from the same period last year. In fact, the number of those unemployed stood at 1.2 million in February, the highest level in 2 years. The state-run agency points to an increase in the number of young people seeking jobs for the seemingly contradicting figures that show an increase in both the number of newly employed workers and unemployed people. Those in their 20s who are new college graduates are now searching for work ahead of recruitment season, which runs from late February to April this year. Kim Ji-yeon, Arirang News.
Could a resolution to a nationwide doctor strike be in the making? With just hours after Prime Minister Chung Kong-won proposed talks on ending the dispute by March 20th, the medical community said Wednesday evening they're open to the idea. The Korean Medical Association, upset over government reforms they say will eventually lead to privatization of the medical sector, staged a one-day strike on Monday and plans a 6-day strike beginning March 24th. That second walkout stands to be larger than the first, as resident staff at Seoul National University Hospital and Asan Medical Center announced they would be participating. Korea's 3 mobile carriers will be forced to suspend their businesses for 45 days starting Thursday as punishment for providing subsidies to attract clients. The first 2 firms to undergo the disciplinary measure are KT and LGU+. The KT will have its business suspended until April 26th, while LGU+ was ordered to close its doors until April 4th and again from 27th to May 18th. The SK Telecom will be suspended from April 5th to May 19th. During the suspension, the companies are prohibited from attracting new customers, and users will be banned from changing their mobile devices unless it has been damaged, lost, or used for over 2 years. Moving now to some of the top stories on the global front, from the mystery of the Malaysian airliner to Chile's first female president being sworn in for a 2nd term. We now go over to Rapal Lee at the News Center. Rapal, let's start with the latest in the search for that missing plane. What do we know so far?
Well, GA, frustrations are mounting after 5 days of search efforts with still no sign of wreckage from Malaysia Airlines Flight 370. The international teams have further expanded their search after earlier reports of military radar signals came to a dead end. Our Kim Hyun-bin has the details.
The search for a missing Malaysian airliner stretched into its 5th day on Wednesday, with still no concrete evidence to explain what happened to the plane and the more than 230 people who are on board. With no sign of the plane, the search area has been expanded to an area that stretches all the way from China to the Andaman Sea, west of Thailand. This after Vietnam briefly scaled down its search operations after saying it had been getting mixed signals from Malaysia over the flight path of Flight 370. Authorities continue to look for clues that may explain what happened.
I think there's a lot of speculation right now. Some claims of responsibility that have not been, confirmed or corroborated at all. We are looking at it very carefully.
The Malaysian military says the plane was in the air for over an hour before it vanished from radar and had traveled about 500 kilometers off course. It added that the plane's transponder and tracking devices were switched off after the plane veered off track. Some experts speculate that there might have been a sudden electrical malfunction on the plane, pointing out that backup power would only last an hour. Officials have not ruled out the possibility of pilot suicide, as transponder signals are controlled in the cockpit. Adding to the confusion, a Malaysian newspaper quoted Malaysian Air Force Chief Razali Daud on Tuesday as saying that military radar had tracked the missing plane to the Strait of Malacca. Razali denies he ever made the comments. Kim Hyun-bin, Arirang News.
Indeed, a frustrating situation there. But Paul, let's move now to the latest developments in the Ukrainian crisis. What can you tell us?
Well, Kiev's government has stationed troops along the Crimea border and mobilized air defenses after interim leaders established a new National Guard in response to what they called Russian aggression. As of Tuesday, Ukraine had as few as 6,000 combat-ready infantry, while its air force was outnumbered nearly 100-1 by Moscow's fleet. Acting President Alexander Turchinov blamed his ousted predecessor, Viktor Yanukovych, for leaving the military in such a poor state, saying it had to be rebuilt effectively from scratch. Meanwhile, Ukraine's interim Prime Minister Arseniy Yatsenyuk will meet with U.S. President Barack Obama on Wednesday. Yatsenyuk will then address the UN Security Council Thursday, where he is widely expected to condemn Crimea's upcoming referendum to join the Russian Federation and appeal to Western powers for assistance.
And moving to South America, we hear Chile's first female president was officially sworn in on this Tuesday for her 2nd term in office. Fill us in.
Well, Michelle Bachelet's first term ran from 2006 to 2010. It's the first time in over half a century that Chilean president has returned as head of state. The 62-year-old socialist leader was inaugurated at a ceremony in the port of Valparaiso, which was attended by foreign dignitaries, including the presidents of Argentina, Brazil, and Colombia. Bachelet said she would work to bring about a better quality of life for all Chileans.
I hope that on the day when I leave office, you will find that life has become better. Chile will not only be a better nation measured by indices and statistics, but also a truly nicer and more livable society for its people.
Bachelet campaigned on a promise to address social inequality. She's also pledged to overhaul the country's education and healthcare systems through tax reforms. Analysts, however, say she has her work cut out for her as Chile's economy has slowed in recent years.
And lastly, Paul, let's head over to the United States. We hear the CIA is again under fire again for allegedly spying on Congress. What's this about?
Well, Dianne Feinstein, who chairs the Senate's Intelligence Committee, says the CIA improperly searched the computers of congressional staff who were investigating the controversial interrogation methods during the George W. Bush administration. Feinstein criticized the agency for allegedly obstructing the oversight probe and demanded an apology for what she called inappropriate actions.
I have grave concerns that the CIA's search may well have violated the separation of powers principles embodied in the United States Constitution, including the Speech and Debate Clause. It may have undermined the constitutional framework essential to effective congressional oversight of intelligence activities or any other government function.
CIA Director John Brennan dismissed the accusations, saying that nothing could be further from the truth. GA?
All right, Paul, thanks for the wrap-up of the international stories making headlines around the world. We'll see you back with more updates in just about 2 hours' time. And time to get a check on the weather with our Kim Bo-kyung at the Weather Center. Now, Bo-kyung, we had finally seen some spring rain here in the capital today, finally.
That's right, and that's good news because dry weather advisories have finally been lifted. Humidity levels are up to 89% here in the capital and even 100% in some regions. Taking a closer look at the current conditions, the nation is under the influence of a low-pressure trough from the southwest, which is why we're seeing cloudy skies and drizzles nationwide. Well, it has stopped raining here in Seoul, but the south coast regions are still seeing heavy rainfall at this hour. In fact, a heavy rainfall watch has been issued on the mountains of Jeju, which may get more than 80 millimeters of total precipitation. Other than that, a heads up for those of you in Gangwon, where 3 to 10 centimeters of snow is forecast to fall. Moving on to Thursday's readings, Seoul starts off the day at 4 degrees with a high of 10. Meanwhile, cities down south will continue to see showers with a daytime high of 8. Moving on to other regions, Jeju and Dokdo peak at 9 and 5 degrees, while Mount Kumgang tops out at -3. That's all for now, and here's a look at the international weather.
And that brings us to the end of our newscast. I'm Yoo Ji-hye in Seoul. I'll be back with more news updates on our primetime news at 10 p.m. Korea time. See you then.